July 20, 2020. A quiet morning in Tennessee was suddenly shattered by panic. The summer heat was already rising off the pavement. And in the driveway of a suburban home, 18-year-old Grant Solomon lay critically injured beside a pickup truck and boat trailer. Neighbors would later recall the chaos. The screams. The confusion. A father desperately calling for help. Grant Solomon was known as a talented young baseball player with dreams of building a future in the sport he loved. Friends and family described him as driven, athletic, and focused on the next chapter of his life. But that future ended in a matter of moments. Authorities publicly ruled Grant's death a tragic accident involving the truck. Case closed. Or at least, officially. Because almost immediately, questions began spreading online. Questions about the scene. Questions about the injuries. Questions about the complicated and deeply divided Solomon family. Then came even more disturbing allegations. Claims later made publicly by Grant's mother and sister suggested years of fear, manipulation, abuse accusations, and bitter family court battles behind closed doors. At the center of it all stood Grant's father, Aaron Solomon, who has repeatedly denied wrongdoing and maintained that Grant's death was a devastating accident. But for many following the case, the official explanation never fully answered the growing suspicion surrounding what happened that morning. Some people believe Grant Solomon died in a tragic accident. Others believe the truth was buried before the investigation ever truly began. And years later, Grant's own mother, Angie Solomon, would herself be arrested after a shocking confrontation connected to the same family tragedy. So how did one Tennessee family become the center of one of the internet's most controversial true crime debates? Tonight, we go back to the very beginning. Tonight on Dark Case Files. The disturbing and deeply controversial case of Grant Solomon. A case that began with the death of an 18-year-old baseball player. And slowly evolved into years of accusations, courtroom conflict, online investigations, and a deeply fractured family fighting competing versions of the truth. What made this story explode across the internet wasn't just Grant's death itself. It was everything that came after. Public records. Custody disputes. Family interviews. Social media campaigns. And allegations that painted radically different pictures of what was happening behind closed doors inside the Solomon family. As online attention intensified, thousands of people began dissecting every detail of the case, from police findings to court filings, trying to determine whether Grant's death was truly a tragic accident, or something far more disturbing. But it's important to remember this. No one has ever been criminally charged in connection with Grant Solomon's death. Authorities officially ruled the incident accidental. And many of the allegations discussed publicly over the years remain disputed. This episode contains discussions involving alleged family abuse, emotional trauma, mental health struggles, and the death of a teenager. Viewer discretion is advised. If you're new to Dark Case Files, subscribe and turn on notifications. We release new deep dive true crime documentaries every week. Because to understand why the Grant Solomon case became one of the internet's most debated true crime stories, we first need to understand the Solomon family itself. And according to people close to the case, the cracks in that family may have started years before Grant's death ever happened. Just south of Nashville sits Franklin, a fast-growing Tennessee community known for its quiet neighborhoods, strong church culture, and highly competitive youth sports scene. On the surface, it was the kind of place many families dreamed of living. Friday night football games. Weekend baseball tournaments. Church gatherings. Carefully maintained homes lined along peaceful suburban streets. In communities like this, reputation matters. Families often know each other for years. Parents spend countless hours traveling to games, practices, and tournaments. And for young athletes hoping to stand out, sports can become more than a hobby. They become identity. For Grant Solomon, baseball appeared to be at the center of that identity. Friends and family members described Grant as athletic, disciplined, and focused. Publicly shared photos showed a teenager who seemed deeply invested in the game, traveling for tournaments, training constantly, and dreaming about opportunities beyond high school baseball. People who knew him often remembered his manners first. Polite. Respectful. Driven. The kind of teenager adults spoke highly of. And on the field, Grant reportedly carried himself with the confidence of someone who believed his future was still unfolding. Photos from those years show moments that now feel haunting in retrospect. Grant smiling beside teammates. Grant posing in uniform. Grant standing under bright stadium lights with his entire life seemingly ahead of him. To the outside world, he looked like a young man moving toward adulthood with momentum. But according to later public statements from people close to the family, there were tensions behind the scenes that few outsiders fully understood. Still, those who cared about Grant often spoke about how much baseball meant to him. The practices. The competition. The structure. The dream. For many young athletes, sports become a place of escape, a world where pressure temporarily disappears beneath routines, teamwork, and ambition. And by 18 years old, Grant stood at a turning point in life. Graduation. Adulthood. New freedom. A future that still felt unwritten. Imagine being 18 years old, standing at the edge of adulthood. Believing your entire future was still ahead of you. But according to allegations that would later surface publicly, the reality inside the Solomon household may have been far more complicated than anyone realized. Because behind the baseball photos and suburban normalcy, the Solomon family itself was beginning to fracture. At the center of the story was a family of four. Aaron Solomon. Angie Solomon. Their son, Grant Solomon. And Grant's younger sister, Gracie Solomon. From the outside, they appeared to fit the image of a successful suburban Tennessee family. Youth sports. School activities. Family milestones. Smiling photographs posted online. But according to public court records and later interviews, the relationship between Grant's parents had become deeply strained over time. Eventually, the marriage collapsed. And after the divorce, tensions reportedly escalated into years of conflict involving custody arrangements, accusations, and legal disputes that would continue long after the separation itself. Like many bitter custody battles, two completely different narratives began to emerge. Each side accused the other of manipulation and dishonesty. Each side claimed to be protecting the children. And over time, the conflict appeared to become increasingly personal and emotionally charged. Publicly available court filings and statements later referenced allegations involving controlling behavior, emotional distress, and ongoing family instability. Some allegations centered around claims of manipulation and intimidation inside the household. Others involved disputes over parenting, custody, and communication between family members. It's important to emphasize that many of these allegations were strongly disputed. No criminal conviction related to abuse allegations was ever secured against Aaron Solomon, and he has repeatedly denied wrongdoing in public statements and legal proceedings. But despite the disputes, the accusations themselves would eventually become a major part of the public conversation surrounding Grant's death. And according to people close to the case, the emotional divide inside the family only continued to grow. As the years passed, the Solomon family maintained a largely polished public image online. Photos from sporting events. Family moments. Milestones. The kind of carefully curated life many people share on social media every day. But after Grant's death, internet users began revisiting those images with a completely different perspective. Suddenly, strangers online were analyzing family dynamics frame by frame. Old posts. Court documents. Interviews. Body language. Timelines. What began as a local tragedy slowly transformed into a national online obsession. TikTok creators discussed theories. YouTube channels dissected allegations. True crime communities debated whether authorities had missed something critical. And in the middle of it all were real people, grieving, accusing, defending, and fighting publicly over what the truth actually was. Because behind the family photos and suburban normalcy, allegations of fear and dysfunction were becoming harder to ignore. But behind closed doors, people close to the family would later claim Grant had become increasingly afraid. By the summer of 2020, the world outside had already changed. Lockdowns. Empty streets. Cancelled sports seasons. A strange silence that settled over everyday life. In Tennessee, like everywhere else, families were confined to their homes more than usual. Routines were disrupted. School schedules were uncertain. And for young athletes like Grant Solomon, the future of competitive sports suddenly felt unclear. The structure that once defined his daily life, practices, games, tournaments, had been stripped away. And inside that uncertainty, family tensions, according to later public accounts, reportedly continued behind closed doors. Those close to the case would later describe Grant as someone navigating not just the challenges of growing up, but also emotional pressure that others around him interpreted in very different ways. Some family statements and public interviews suggested he was experiencing emotional strain. Others have strongly disputed that characterization, describing a teenager focused on his future and personal independence. What is clear from public accounts is that the narratives surrounding Grant's state of mind were deeply conflicting. There was no single agreed version of what he was going through. And that divide would later become central to how people interpreted the events of July 20th. As the days approached that morning, public reporting and timeline reconstructions suggest a normal rhythm of life continuing on the surface: phone activity, family interactions, and routine movement around the household. But in hindsight, every detail would be re-examined. Every timestamp. Every message. Every reported step. Online investigators would later construct detailed timelines, attempting to piece together the final hours leading up to the incident. But official records remained limited in what they confirmed publicly. The focus narrows. Hours become minutes. Minutes become fragments. And then, the morning of July 20th arrives. It is early. The light is still soft, not yet fully burning through the Tennessee sky. The air is already warm, thick with summer heat rising off the pavement. At the Solomon home, a truck is being prepared, a pickup connected to a boat trailer, part of what was reportedly a routine task that morning. Aaron Solomon is present. And so is Grant Solomon. The exact sequence of what happens next has been described through official accounts, witness statements, and later public reporting. But even those details became part of the broader controversy surrounding the case. What remains consistent in the official narrative is that something goes terribly wrong in the driveway. The sound of machinery. The movement of the vehicle. The sudden escalation into panic. Then, chaos. A call for help. A father screaming for emergency assistance. In those moments, the quiet suburban morning is shattered completely. Neighbors would later describe confusion. Shock. The sudden intrusion of emergency response into an otherwise ordinary neighborhood. And as sirens began to approach, nothing about the rest of that day would ever feel normal again. Within minutes, something would happen that would divide public opinion for years. Because what unfolded in that Tennessee driveway would later be documented in official reports, yet still questioned by thousands of people who encountered the case long after the fact. According to the official narrative reported through law enforcement accounts and medical findings, the incident involving Grant Solomon occurred during what was described as a vehicle and trailer-related accident in the early hours of July 20, 2020. Emergency services were called to the scene. And responders arrived to find a chaotic situation already unfolding. From there, the details that became public were interpreted in two very different ways. On one hand, official accounts maintained that the incident was accidental in nature, a tragic outcome of a sudden and unforeseen mechanical or situational failure involving the vehicle setup present that morning. On the other hand, as more people examined publicly available information in the months and years that followed, questions began to emerge online. Not through official updates, but through commentary, discussion, and analysis shared across social media platforms and true crime communities. Some questioned the sequence of events as it had been publicly described. Others focused on inconsistencies they believed they saw in timelines, physical positioning, or mechanical possibility, though these interpretations were never formally established as fact in any court of law. It's important to emphasize. There has been no criminal conviction related to Grant Solomon's death. And authorities have publicly maintained the classification of the incident as an accident. But despite that, the case did not fade into silence. Instead, it grew louder online. Two narratives began to exist at the same time. One rooted in official documentation and investigative conclusions. The other shaped by public interpretation, unanswered questions, and emotional reaction to the tragedy. And the gap between those two narratives only widened as time went on. Family members themselves would later give statements and interviews that were also interpreted differently depending on who was listening, further deepening the divide in public perception. But none of those discussions changed the official classification of what happened that morning. Still, the questions persisted. And for many people following the case closely, one central uncertainty remained impossible to ignore. What exactly happened in those final moments before emergency responders arrived? Was it simply a devastating accident, unfolding in seconds? Or was there something about that morning that has never been fully understood by the public? Would you have immediately accepted the accident explanation, or would you have questioned it too? The driveway. This is where the timeline narrows. And everything changes. According to publicly reported accounts and investigative summaries surrounding the incident involving Grant Solomon, the early morning of July 20, 2020 took place at a private residential driveway in Tennessee. A pickup truck. A boat trailer. A routine task that had been performed many times before. But on this morning, something went wrong. In official descriptions that were later released publicly, the situation escalated suddenly during vehicle and trailer movement. There was a moment of instability. A shift in control. A sequence of events that unfolded in seconds rather than minutes. And then, impact. Within moments, emergency services were called to the scene. Dispatch records and public reporting confirm a rapid response to a serious injury situation. Paramedics arrived to find urgency already overwhelming the scene. Efforts were made immediately to provide medical assistance. The situation, however, was critical from the outset. Neighbors later described a surreal shift, the quiet of a normal Tennessee morning replaced instantly by sirens, urgency, and emergency personnel movement. In the hours and days that followed, official statements maintained a consistent position: the incident involving Grant Solomon was treated as an accidental death. There were no criminal charges. No public indication of foul play in official conclusions. But online, the reaction was very different. As news of the incident spread, discussions began appearing across social platforms, where users began analyzing publicly available details. Some questioned the mechanics of what had occurred. Others focused on inconsistencies they believed they saw in descriptions shared online. And many were simply trying to understand how such a sudden tragedy could happen in an ordinary residential setting. It is important to state clearly: these discussions were not part of any formal legal ruling. They were interpretations circulating in public forums, not established findings. Still, they grew rapidly. Inside the family, grief unfolded in very different directions. Public statements and interviews over time reflected a deep and painful divide. Angie Solomon later publicly raised questions about the official explanation of events, expressing doubts and calling for further scrutiny. At the same time, Aaron Solomon maintained that the incident was a tragic accident, consistently supporting the original conclusion reported by authorities. Meanwhile, Gracie Solomon also became part of the public conversation online, sharing her perspective and adding another layer to an already fractured family narrative. What was once private grief became public conflict. And in the middle of it all was a single devastating reality. An 18-year-old life was gone. In one moment. An entire family shattered publicly in front of the world. But the controversy was only beginning. A family at war. In the immediate aftermath of the incident involving Grant Solomon, local Tennessee media began reporting on what was initially described as a tragic accident in a quiet suburban neighborhood. Early headlines were restrained. A young life lost. A family in mourning. A sudden, devastating incident that had shocked the community. Public sympathy quickly followed. Friends, neighbors, and members of the local community expressed grief over the loss of an 18-year-old described as bright, athletic, and full of potential. At that stage, the story was still being understood through an official lens, one focused on tragedy, not controversy. But that interpretation didn't remain uncontested for long. As news of the case circulated beyond Tennessee, it entered a very different space, the world of online true crime communities. Platforms like became central hubs for discussion. Users began creating breakdown videos, timeline analyses, theoretical reconstructions, and commentary threads dissecting every publicly available detail. Hashtags related to the case began circulating widely, and engagement grew rapidly as more people encountered the story. This wasn't traditional journalism. It was internet sleuth culture. A decentralized network of users attempting to interpret complex real-world events through fragments of public information. And with that came something else. Growing distrust of official narratives. Not necessarily grounded in new evidence, but in interpretation, comparison, and speculation. It is important to note that these online discussions were not part of any formal investigation. They represented public reaction, not legal conclusion. Still, their influence on public perception was significant. As the case continued to circulate, attention also turned toward publicly discussed medical and investigative findings related to the death of Grant Solomon. Certain users online examined reported details and attempted to interpret them through their own analysis. Some focused on the nature of injuries described in public discourse. Others questioned how the mechanics of the incident were understood. And many debated whether all available information had been fully explained in a way the public could clearly understand. These interpretations varied widely, and often conflicted with one another. However, it remains critical to emphasize. The official ruling from authorities remained that the death was accidental. No criminal charges were filed in connection with the incident. Despite that, the gap between official conclusions and public discussion continued to widen online. Amid the growing online attention, Gracie Solomon became part of the public conversation. Through online statements and public commentary, she shared her personal perspective on the family situation and her experiences surrounding the events. Her statements contributed to a deeply emotional and highly polarized public discussion. In her account, she raised serious allegations regarding family dynamics and the environment she described growing up in. It is important to state clearly. These were allegations and personal claims shared publicly. They have been disputed and are not the subject of any criminal conviction related to Grant Solomon's death. At the same time, her voice added another layer of emotional complexity to an already fractured situation, one shaped by grief, disagreement, and public scrutiny. For many observers, it reinforced the sense that this case was not only about a single tragic event, but about a family divided in the aftermath of it. And then, the case took another shocking turn. When the family conflict escalated beyond social media. Questions without answers. As public attention around the death of Grant Solomon continued to grow, the focus shifted toward one central issue: what did official investigators conclude, and why? According to publicly available law enforcement findings and medical reporting, authorities classified the incident involving Grant Solomon as an accidental death. Investigators reviewed the scene, the vehicle setup, and the circumstances surrounding the early morning event in Tennessee. An accident reconstruction was conducted based on physical evidence observed at the location, along with statements gathered at the time. The medical examiner's conclusion, as reported publicly, aligned with the broader official interpretation that the fatal injuries were consistent with a tragic accident rather than intentional harm. Based on these combined findings, authorities maintained that there was no indication of criminal wrongdoing connected to the incident. And as a result, no arrests were made in relation to Grant Solomon's death. No homicide charges were filed. And the case was officially classified as accidental. But for many following the case online, that conclusion did not end the questions. As details of the case circulated publicly, some independent commentators began raising concerns about the scope and clarity of the investigation. Online analysts and true crime creators questioned whether all aspects of the scene had been fully explored in a way the public could easily understand. Some pointed to perceived gaps in publicly released information. Others highlighted what they believed were inconsistencies in timelines or interpretations of physical evidence. It is important to note. These critiques were not part of any formal legal finding. They represented public commentary and analysis, not judicial conclusion. Still, they gained traction in online spaces where cases like this are often re-examined in detail. The Grant Solomon case became part of a larger phenomenon, the rise of digital true crime investigation culture. On social media platforms, users created breakdown videos analyzing every available public detail. This new form of public investigation blurred the line between awareness and interpretation. And it raised a difficult question. Can internet investigators uncover truths authorities miss, or can online speculation make tragedies even worse? In the center of this digital storm remained a grieving and divided family. As public discussion intensified, attention also turned toward prior family court matters involving Aaron Solomon and Angie Solomon. Publicly available records and statements referenced ongoing custody disputes, legal disagreements, and protective order discussions over time. These matters became part of the broader online narrative surrounding the family. However, it is essential to emphasize clearly: the allegations discussed publicly in relation to family dynamics were disputed. And there was no criminal conviction tied to abuse allegations connected to the death of Grant Solomon. Even so, these claims continued to shape public interpretation of the case, especially as more people discovered the story online. Then came a turning point that reignited national attention. Angie Solomon was reported to have been arrested following a confrontation-related incident that quickly spread through news outlets and social media. Details of the arrest were widely discussed online, with reports describing a tense situation that led to police involvement. The incident sparked immediate public reaction. Some saw it as further evidence of long-standing family conflict. Others viewed it as a deeply tragic escalation of grief and unresolved trauma. Visuals of police lights, court references, and mugshot headlines circulated rapidly across platforms, fueling renewed interest in the entire case. At this stage, the case was no longer just about a single incident. It had become a deeply divided public debate. Some believed the mother's actions reflected a pursuit of justice and answers she felt were never fully provided. Others argued that the online narrative had spiraled far beyond verified facts, turning a tragedy into a web of competing theories. And in the middle of it all remained conflicting interpretations of the same set of events, each shaped by emotion, belief, and perspective. At this point, who did you believe? And despite years of public debate, the official ruling never changed. The case today. Years after the death of Grant Solomon, the case continues to exist in two parallel worlds. One is defined by official records. The other is shaped by public interpretation. In the aftermath of renewed public attention, Angie Solomon became the subject of further legal and media scrutiny following reported arrest-related developments that circulated widely online and in news coverage. Public reaction was immediate and divided. Some viewed the developments through the lens of long-standing family conflict that had already been widely discussed in online spaces. Others approached it with caution, emphasizing that legal incidents do not automatically confirm broader claims made on social media. Media coverage intensified briefly, with headlines revisiting the Solomon family history and the earlier tragedy that first brought national attention to the case. But even with renewed scrutiny, no new official conclusion was issued regarding the death of Grant Solomon. Despite years of discussion, speculation, and online analysis, one fact has remained unchanged in official records. No one has been charged in connection with the death of Grant Solomon. Authorities have not reversed the original classification of the incident. And the case continues to be publicly treated as an accidental death based on available investigative conclusions. There has been no court ruling that reclassifies the manner of death. No criminal trial related to homicide. And no official determination contradicting the original findings. Outside of official channels, however, the conversation has never truly stopped. Petitions have circulated online calling for further review of the case. Documentary creators and independent investigators continue to revisit timelines, statements, and publicly available records. Social media platforms periodically see renewed waves of attention, often triggered by new commentary, reposted clips, or anniversary discussions. For many participants in these online communities, the case represents more than just a single incident. It has become a symbol of unresolved questions, and the belief that some answers may still be missing. But at the same time, these discussions remain outside the formal legal system. Throughout the years of public debate, Aaron Solomon has consistently denied allegations of wrongdoing related to the death of his son. In public statements and legal contexts, he has maintained that the incident was a tragic accident. His position has remained unchanged. A devastating loss. An unforeseen event. A conclusion supported by official investigative findings. Despite ongoing public scrutiny and conflicting interpretations online, his stance has remained consistent over time. Even with official findings in place, the case continues to generate discussion because of what it represents to different people. For some, the evidence and official conclusions provide closure. For others, unanswered questions remain tied not only to the incident itself, but to the broader family conflict that developed in its aftermath. The emotional divide persists online. Interpretations continue to clash. And time has not fully resolved the disagreement over what people believe happened. Because in cases like this, facts and perception often live side by side, without ever fully aligning. For some people, the case is solved. For others, the real story has never been fully told. What really happened to Grant Solomon? Years after the incident involving Grant Solomon, that question still echoes through online discussions, documentaries, and private conversations. But beyond the theories, the headlines, and the divided opinions, there remains a much quieter reality. A family that fractured under public scrutiny. A tragedy that became widely discussed far beyond its original community. And a young life that was suddenly cut short, leaving behind grief that has never fully resolved. In the years since, the Solomon family story has been viewed through multiple lenses: legal, emotional, and digital. Each one shaped by different interpretations of the same events, and each carrying its own version of truth as understood by those involved. But at the center of it all is something no narrative can change. An 18-year-old whose future was never allowed to unfold. This case also reflects something larger about the modern world. The way personal tragedies can become public discourse. The way court records and social media posts can merge into competing narratives. And the way online communities can amplify both awareness and uncertainty. It highlights the danger of unresolved conflict becoming public spectacle. The complexity of accusations that exist outside criminal convictions. And the power and risk of digital true crime communities trying to reconstruct events they were never present for. Because while public discussion can bring attention to overlooked details, it can also deepen emotional wounds for those still living through the aftermath. And that is why one reminder matters above all else. Allegations are not convictions. Interpretations are not verdicts. And public speculation can carry real consequences for real people. The field is still now. No crowd. No cheering. No movement. Just silence where a future once seemed certain. At the center of all the arguments, all the theories, and all the headlines, was an 18-year-old young man whose life ended far too soon. What shocked you the most about the Grant Solomon case? Let me know respectfully in the comments below. If you enjoyed this deep dive documentary, like this video, subscribe to Dark Case Files, and share this episode with someone interested in true crime investigations. Next week, we're covering another disturbing real-life case that left investigators searching for answers for years.